Welcome back. So I hope you had a chance to watch the film Agora. It's not historically perfectly accurate. I don't know that any film could be, given that we know everything about history. Um, but I think it's hopefully the idea was that it would give you a sort of a feel for, the details of living at time, and it's a pretty good movie as well. So hopefully that was enjoyable. This will be a relatively brief lecture. I just want to touch on some of the points that I found sort of interesting and relevant to our course. We're in the- So again, setting the stage. So we're in the late 300s AD, and so this is the sort of decline of the Western Roman Empire. This takes place in Egypt, in Alexandria, an area we haven't spent a ton of time on when speaking about the Roman Empire, but it's on the sort of the southern side of the Mediterranean. So it's certainly, at the core of this Mediterranean area that uh, in the center of trade and life for the Greeks and then the Romans. Obviously the Egyptians had empires dating much further before the Greeks and the Romans, like thousands of years. So the Egypt has been in the story, right, this whole time. We haven't focused on it very much. So it was conquered by Rome, and Alexandria, which is on the sort of the north tip, right on the Mediterranean there, is now at this time a Roman province. So it's best known for its library and as a center of scholarship. The Library of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the world. It was destroyed sort of, and a lot of the manuscripts were lost. You may have noticed in the film that they were didn't have books yet, long scrolls. Uh, it was also a pagan temple, so again, science and religion had not come apart in important sense. All the scholars believed in the gods, and uh, you notice in the astronomy in the film, right, that there's a lot of stress is placed on like, well, everything has to be perfect, right? Like there's an assumption that there's like a design, right, and that that things happen in perfect circles and so on. It's really hard for people um, to digest the idea that maybe orbits are elliptical and things like that. So at this stage, Alexandria has a pretty diverse religious population. There's some scenes in the marketplace, right, where you see lots of different people in different outfits that look to all be different nationalities or religious groups. So it is a very diverse population. There's pagans there, there's Jews. Christianity has been on the rise. Christians were sort of banned and persecuted, and it's recent development at the time of this film. At the time this film takes place, it had no longer been banned and became a legal thing to practice and was growing in popularity. So our main character, Rachel Weisz's character, is named Hypatia. She's an astronomer and she's a woman. So a big chunk of the film's plot revolves around, which is probably what is probably the most historically dubious element, right? So they have Hypatia here basically discovering that the Ptolemaic model of the universe, which put the Earth at the center, was false, right? And then the sun must be at the center. She also figures out that the uh, orbits of the planets are elliptical. So, this was things that got figured out, much later. Right? You had to have Copernicus and um, and uh, I'm blanking on the name, elliptical orbit. Uh, hold on, hold on. Kepler. I came into my mind as soon as I paused it. These are like 1500s stuff. So people they mention a Greek astronomer who had posited the heliocentric model as well, and she's working with that. You know, maybe not, right? There's no evidence. We do know that she worked on conic sections, one of which is an ellipse, but we just can't know really whether or not, she thought about the stuff and the possibility that the orbits were elliptical. But at any rate, the problem with the Ptolemaic system So it puts the Earth at the center, right? And so the moon is in here. Here's the picture. This is the Ptolemaic system. And you'll notice like you get to Mercury and Venus here, and they've got these orbiting within an orbit, right? That's because when we observe, um, right, these bodies moving through the sky at night, they don't seem to trace a perfect circular path. They will sort of pause, move backwards, right? When people say Mercury is in retrograde, if you ever heard that, from astrology, I mean, that's a real thing. It means that the Mercury sort of stops and appears to move backwards for a while before it then moves again across the sky. So they had to try to figure out how to explain that, right? That our observations don't seem to match up with the idea that planets are just moving in a straightforward circular orbit around the Earth. So they posited that they all had to be perfect circles, right? That was just an assumption. It's all going to be perfect circles. So they assumed that they also had little perfect circles within their orbit, right? And that would explain what we observe from the Earth. Um, it preserves the circles, but it's not as appealing if you think that if you value simplicity. And there is still a default supposition that the simpler theory, given two theories, the simpler one will be the better one. And so uh, there's something uncomfortable about uh, account, right? Even though um, it does make sense of our observations, right? It doesn't make any false predictions, but it feels like an overly complicated theory, a little ad hoc, right? Okay, so anyways, there's a good chunk of the plot is tied up with that, and it's interesting stuff, particularly if you like history of science, philosophy of science. Um, but it's not possibly the most historically accurate as far as like what was going on with the So another interesting thing is the way they portrayed slaves here, right? And there's, I think, something right about it. So we have Davis here, and this is Hypatia's slave, and in many ways, so she seems very kind to him, right? And very friendly, and even respect him as his intellect, right? At one point, she says, "Hey, right, Davis is sort of doing better than the rest of you folks in my class and all you my students, right?" But at the same time, you constantly see reminders that he is just completely in a different class than her, right? So he's there, as she bathes, right? He's there, sort of, he hands her the towel or whatever, and it doesn't ever cross her mind to be embarrassed, right, to be naked around a slave because they're not um, that kind of, they're not, in a sense, not human, right? Like it's just not being that you would worry about. And you'll also see other moments when she's stressed out, right? Or like um, she will sort of just command him to for be snippy with him, right? Even as friendly as she is, they're not. You know what I mean? But it's also interesting, right? Later on, we see Davis interacting with one of the Christians, right? One of the Parabolano, and they're engaged with feeding the poor and helping the poor. And so Davis interacts and he says, "Hey, give these groceries you have. Why don't you give them to the poor?" And Davis is like, "Hey, um, that's going to come out of my own money if I do that, right?" Well, that's sort of surprising that a slave would have money, right? And then also notice that the poor people he's feeding, they're not necessarily slaves, right? They're just poor people. So in a sense, they may have a higher status than him, right? But he's obviously given, right, he owns him. He has a nice, much nicer lifestyle than a lot of people in the empire, right? So he is, in an important sense, sort of less human, right, for his master, and he's whipped at one point, right, for insubordination. But that doesn't mean that he's completely immiserated in other sense, in a material sense, right? He has nice clothes and he even has a little pocket money. And then we see later Hypatia's father is ultimately killed by one of his slaves, and we've seen this has also been a concern back since the Greeks, is whenever you have slavery, um, and you have, a lot of slaves if you're running a farm. Hypatia's father is running a farm, but if you have more slaves than household members, which is often the case, you do have to worry about rebellion and murder you. And that does happen in one of the melee scenes, right, when there's chaos around the temple. So we see Christians portrayed here. We see the sort of ascendancy of Christianity over the course of the film, right? At the beginning, it's a minority sect that's on the rise that has just become legal. And then by the end of the film, Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire and are pretty much in control. Like they're the majority. Um, so you see them early on arguing in the marketplace. Notice they're a little theatrical, right? Ammonius, who is sort of the main character we see, the Ravelano. He's like walking through fire, and miracles are a part of the Christian story, and you can sort of see the appeal of that, right? About this film, it's like it takes you out of a time where Christianity's been around for thousands of years and puts you in a time where it's on equal footing with paganism, right? And you're just seeing it as a competing religion, and you see uh, it helps you to see, okay, here's how it's different. Here's how I could see it being more appealing. Here's how I could see it, right, it becoming what it ultimately became. Um, Another reason in popularity was this concern with helping the poorest in society, right? They were out there feeding the poor. You notice that some of the slaves in Hypatia's household are Christians, right? It is popular among the lower classes because it preaches right uh, a certain value, right, for the poor. But there is also, we see it, in that it's monotheistic. There's going to be inherent intolerance in that monotheists cannot allow for the possibility of other gods, right? So when the Christians do gain power, it's going to be hard for them to get along with pagans. Someone who worships other gods is just not going to mesh with Christianity. So, uh, however well intentioned they might be, right? If you're a monotheist, you can't really tolerate other gods, right? Tolerate other religions. Um, it's, I mean, the Christians are the bad guys in this film, right? And obviously, that all Christians are bad, even and or at any time. But this film does record a historical event, right, where Hypatia was killed, and people, looking backwards through the lens, uh, you see, right, the Christians that couldn't bear this pagan woman being in a position of power as, and so, yeah, it was a bad thing to do, right? Are all the Christians bad? No, but this is sort of like this film, right? So, I mean, this film is uh, very much focused on, right, the issue of women, um, and we've seen that women and slaves in Greece and Rome could not be citizens, right, and they were not on equal footing with men. So you might be surprised to see Hypatia in front of the class, right, sort of professor lecturing a group entirely made up of men, and it shows how even though we have these hierarchies, they're fungible, right, and just as we saw a slave might actually be a little better off material than a poor free person, right? A woman might have authority in certain realms that would be greater than a man's. Um, and interesting, this isn't mentioned in the film or in the book, I don't think. But one other reason for Christianity's early popularity was its opposition to divorce. At the time in Rome, you could divorce your wife and she would be left with nothing. Um, and the Christians, by opposing divorce, got some support from women who um, seems sort of odd now, right? From our perspective, you imagine a woman getting divorced and getting half of whatever, all the money, and maybe getting out of a bad situation. Well, from the Roman times, even if your marriage was a bad situation, divorce meant just going from bad to worse, complete destitution and poverty. So by being opposed to divorce, this was actually helpful on sort of a sliding scale. So these categories and hierarchies are complicated, right? So Hypatia, and this is discussed in with when her father is speaking to some other uh, about why doesn't he marry Hypatia off, right? When after she receives a proposal of marriage from Orestes, And the father says, she wouldn't be she wouldn't be able to do what she wants. She wouldn't be able to be a scholar, right? If she was married, then she would be a full-time housewife, right? You couldn't do both. And he knows his daughter well enough. He understands that the kind of life she wants, right? So, Hypatia's in one sense very lucky, right? She has a father who has some money and who understands his daughter and is willing to, uh, you know, put up with her not being married, right, and not gaining that sort of social status, so that she can do what she wants. So that does allow her some freedom for a time. Of course, we see in the end that even that bit of freedom was not tolerable to a lot of people, and she's ultimately murdered. So we hear this term Parabolano, right? So this is a particular Christian sect. It was a real sect that existed. They were particularly concerned with helping the poor. Um, this is not, this is one of many sort of Christian sects, and they don't represent all Christianity. And we see they get fairly nasty towards the end of it. Um, but in this film, they're kind of most of the Christians you see are the Parabolani. Not all of them, right? So there was one Christian in um, Ignatius' classroom, you may recall. Davis is a Christian who's not necessarily associated with the Parabolani. So just to give you a perspective, right, that a lot of these folks, but it's just one small sect, and, a larger, lots of different types floating around. Particularly early on in these early years, there were lots of different. It's a right the mystery of the Trinity, right, which is that God is in three parts, right? The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but also in one, and also that was a human, but also God or the Son of God. All of the trickiness around that whole confusing thing, um, a lot of splinter groups, right? That had lots of different interpretations of what was going on. Some that said, "Oh, God was completely human," others said, "No, right? Jesus was completely human," others saying Jesus was completely God. Um, Different interpretations of the Trinity. So you had a lot of different uh, types of Christianity floating around that eventually you have the church and you have some sort of around the interpretation of that stuff. But early on, there's a lot of different Christian sects going on, and the that storming of the library, that's a real historical event, right? It's when the Christians, when there's that whole incident, right, where the Christians are mocking the pagan gods, and so then the pagans come and they start something with Christians, and the Christians storm the library, and they're blockaded in the library, and the Christians are let in, and they wreck the place. That all happened. So that's kind of just like the first, I don't know, 30 minutes of the film or so, right? And then we have a break. There's a big leap forward in time, and we see a move from the sort of volatile situation of Christians and pagans are sort of equally matched. Pagans used to being in charge and used to having the Christians be this upstart religion that was illegal, right? And all the tension that comes from that. And then we fast forward, and now Rome is Christian. Um, and so Orestes, one of Hypatia's students, has converted to Christianity. Anybody who wanted to get ahead was going to have to convert to Christianity. He's become the governor of Alexandria, the praetor. Um, they're not paganism is still legal, right? So it's still around, but the Christian majority is becoming again, they're monotheists, they're becoming less and less okay with this pagan stuff going on. And so Orestes is sort of caught in the middle. You get the sense that he's not in his heart maybe a super devoted Christian, right? Maybe he did that for just for advancement, but he's got to tread the fine line, keeping everybody. And we've seen this from the beginning of our discussion of Greek law. Uh, the power of these rulers is contingent, right? That they're constantly worried about, right, the larger part of the population, the lower classes, sort of revolting, and so he does have, if most of the population is Christian and they're, getting pretty edgy and potentially violent, he has to keep that in mind and he has to appease them frequently. So being a ruler, even in Rome, does not have absolute authority, right? To popular sentiment. All right, and then finally we have the death of Hypatia. Uh, so again, this is a historical event. So uh, Theophilus, who was the bishop of Alexandria, was a supporter of Hypatia and allowed her to continue her scholarship, and she could teach, right? So he let her keep doing her thing. But then, even though she was a pagan, right, and people were not happy with a woman in that position of authority, um, after his death, Cyril took over as the new bishop of Alexandria, and he was not as friendly to Hypatia. So there was a conflict between Jews and Christians. Cyril closes the synagogues, confiscates a bunch of Jewish property, both Jews. Uh, this causes some tensions. Cyril and Orestes. Uh, a Christian tries to assassinate Orestes, and so Orestes executes a Christian. Um, and all this sort of tension, right? There's Jews being persecuted, Christians, pagans, like all mad at each other. And Hypatia is sort of an easy scapegoat for this. So people thought, oh, she's a witch. She's controlling Orestes with magic, right? Even though Orestes executed this Christian, Hypatia is blamed for it. So one day she's just out on the street riding in her carriage, and a mob just drags her out of her carriage, stones her to death, tears her limb from limb, drags her body parts through the streets, which is a cool thing to do in the ancient world, the person being dragged. So that happened, right? That was real, and it's a sad story and an interesting episode in history, particularly through the lens of feminism and our current attitudes towards women. It's interesting to see a woman at this time in history in such an important role, and also it's a reaction to a woman in that role. And I think it illustrates nicely. It gives us a sense of like these religions, right? The early Roman Empire that we saw was very tolerant with a lot of different religions going on, and that was one of their sort of successful strategies, right? One of their repertoires, and but also how fragile that is, right? And all you need is a little dose of monotheism getting popular, and all of a sudden you can't keep that religious diversity, and we see the sort of transition over the course of this film to a Christian empire. And we will be talking next about the later Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So the Western Roman Empire falls not long after this film, right? This is in the late 300s and the 400s. Western Rome gets by the Ostrogoths. But by this point, the capital has been moved, right, to Constantinople in Turkey, basically. And so this is now a sort of new center of the Roman Empire, and that version of the Roman Empire will persist for another 1,000 years. So we'll talk about that.